Did everyone get a copy of the notes? We have the notes over here. There's 8 pages. 8 pages that you can take with you and study at home because, again, it's a lot of material. And we're covering in just 10 sessions what is usually covered in a semester in a college setting. So it is a lot of material, and we can't cover everything, but we are doing the highlights. So today's session is really dealing with personal reaction to crisis. That's what we're really talking about, any crisis in your life. And I could just tell you that out of all the people in church this morning, there wasn't anyone here who hasn't had a crisis in their life at some time, because that's part of the definition of being human. And if you fall in love and get married, you're signing up for crisis, because marriage is dealing with a lot of crises in our lives. And then, we have children and how wonderful that is, and what an incredible life-changing experience it was when, we had a baby, and then we had a second baby, and how amazing that was. And then, of course, I didn't realize I had signed up for a whole lifetime of crises with our children. And it seems that you either have crises with your children when they're younger or when they're older, but not always the whole time, hopefully. So our oldest child right now is 57. Our youngest is 55. That's amazing, isn't it? If you're that old, I must be older than that. So the crisis, whatever it is in your life, whether it's moving or losing your job or facing death or the death of a loved one, comes down to 5 stages that we put them in. And we look at these stages as the normal human reaction to crisis. And the first thing that comes along, of course, is denial. I've been diagnosed with cancer 7 times now, but the first time I was diagnosed, I was shocked. It was denial. When the doctor said, "Mr. Walker, you have cancer," you know what I said to him immediately, without even pausing? I said, "Doctor, you must be mistaken. I can't have cancer. I'm the one who goes and visits people with cancer." And then the second stage is anger. And then the third stage is, when you get over that, it's bargaining, and then depression, and finally you break through to acceptance. Now, that's the normal order, but it doesn't have to be in that order. And you can jump around, and you can go backwards, and you can keep going back. That's the normal thing. You'll keep going back to like anger or depression over whatever the bad news is that you're facing. So we could say that these 5 stages are normal reactions, and we have an unusual word, constitutive of humanity. That means that humanity is defined by these reactions. This is part of being human, and no wonder we go through these things, and it can be expected. So by our understanding these 5 stages, it really helps when we live our lives, because we keep coming upon these different things that we could call a crisis of this or a crisis of that. And there's a biblical example in 2 Samuel that you can go and read on your own, but I'd like to go on to number 46, where Hans Kung, who is a very famous theologian in the 1900s in Europe, in Germany, and here he's speaking practically now, which is unusual. When you read Kung, it's a highly convoluted intellectual enterprise. But he says here in plain language, "It is frequently said today that the great taboo is no longer sexuality as it was when Freud was a young man in prudish Vienna, but death and dying." because talking about death and dying is just kind of going against our culture. Sheldon Van Auken wrote an incredible book in which he detailed the loss of his lovely wife. He called it A Severe Mercy, and it tells about her diagnosis and what he did and the reactions and how they fought against it. And as a young woman, she finally died. And in response to a letter one of the many letters that we exchanged, he wrote back to me, "You are right about the churches not facing up, with some brave exceptions, to death and dying. It's because ministers know their people don't want to be reminded of the ineluctable mystery." That's quite a word, ineluctable. That means it can't be voiced. It's part of creeping secularization, looking at death, the one thing their philosophy can't cope with is the last thing in every sense that they want to face. So going to denial, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who we could say would be the father of death and dying studies in the United States, she has since passed away, wrote in 1969 in her absolutely pivotal book called On Death and Dying, "Denial, at least partial denial, is used by almost all patients, not only during the first stages of illness or following confrontation, but also later on from time to time. Who was it who said, 'We cannot look at the sun all the time, we cannot face death all the time'? These patients can consider the possibility of their own death for a while, but then have to put this consideration away in order to pursue life." Because even when you get the diagnosis, terminal diagnosis, there's still life that goes on. And I'd never had a terminal diagnosis, but on January 17th, I had a TIA. And that got my attention. And so I quickly, within 2 weeks, made all of my final arrangements, funeral plans, written instructions to children, because that was like a wake-up call that none of us will escape death, but it will affect all of us. And the natural human reaction is to put off the final things and to not actually do it, not actually make the plans. So Kubler-Ross goes on and says the patient's first reaction may be temporary state of shock from which they recuperate gradually. When his final initial feeling of numbness begins to disappear and he can collect himself again, man's, and this is instead of one's, talk of the 1960s, right? Man's usual response is, "No, it cannot be me. Since in our unconscious mind we are all immortal, it is almost inconceivable for us to acknowledge that we too have to face death, depending very much on how a patient is told, how much time he has to gradually acknowledge the inevitable, inevitable happening, and how he has been prepared throughout his life to cope with, it should be stressful situations, not successful." You know how your computer types in a word for you? You start with one word and first thing you know, you realize it typed another word. Well, all of these pages have all been retyped just for you. And that's how, and I proofread them, but I missed that. So you want to cross out successful and write in stressful. He will gradually drop his denial and use less radical defense mechanisms. And that was true in 1969 when she wrote that, and it's true today. That's the way that the human mind works. So looking at denial, we realize right off that denial can be good and denial can be bad. And denial is the common first response to bad news. 57 years ago, I knew a school secretary who was wonderful at her job. Elementary school, she was kind of the heart and soul of that school. She kept it running. Everyone knew her. All the parents knew her. She was a real dynamo. But she got a diagnosis of ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. She was a lady of great faith. And so she went out to healing meetings. And then finally she traveled all the way to Oklahoma to go to a healing meeting. And a very famous evangelist healed her. And she came back proclaiming her healing and such joy. And it was so wonderful that she was healed. But then she said to me just a few days after her return, I know I've been healed, but I don't feel it in my body. And in fact, she wasn't healed, and she passed away. But she kept that denial, and that was a very important thing for her because it did buy her time in this process of dying. And that's what she needed in order to finally break through and process all of this. So denial is something that it's a mechanism. It can be helpful at first, but of course it has negative consequences the longer it lasts. So how do we deal with a loved one or a friend who then has denial? This is section 49. I think that it's really, really important not to take that denial away. Because if we take that denial away, we're taking hope away. They have to learn to come out of denial on their own. We need to affirm them where they are. So if this person is in denial, we need to affirm them just exactly where they are. They need to have time to deal with their own situation. And as a friend going to see them, you need time to try to assess where they are in the process of dying. We have to respect them. And I know that's really hard for us as a personal friend. And you can imagine what it's like as a professional healthcare worker, like an RN, say from hospice, who goes in and sees the patient, and they ask you, how much time do I have left? And that's the last thing you want to be asked, because frankly, no RN, no medical doctor has really an idea of how long you have left. When you sign up for hospice, you don't sign up to die. You don't have to agree to die. And we had hospice patients who lived on and actually came off of hospice because they were no longer qualified. They weren't dying anymore. So that question, I don't think it's one that we should attempt to answer. How long do you have left? How would we know? We're not even medical people, most of us at least. So we just have to be a good listener. Help them as they learn to confront their own mortality, just as we have to learn to confront our mortality. I mean, if you think that you're the pinnacle of health, it just takes a moment for you to have something like a TIA to remind you that no, you're mortal and your days are just as numbered as another, and as any other person, and we're going to come back to that thought about the number of our days. Sometimes they might be outwardly denying but inwardly knowing. This often leads to discrepancies between what they say and what they do. And so, we don't want to point that out to them. Here's a description of a 28-year-old mother of two preschoolers with terminal liver disease that Dr. Kubler-Ross dealt with. And she said, looking back at this long and meaningful relationship, I am sure that it was possible only because she sensed that we respected her wish to deny her illness as long as possible. I use this example to show that we do not always state explicitly and that the patient is first. Try to become aware of their strengths and weaknesses and look for overt or hidden communications to determine how much a patient wants to face reality at a given moment. This patient, in many ways exceptional, made it quite clear from this very beginning that denial was essential in order for her to remain sane. We don't often think about that. Now, Dr. Ross, of course, Dr. Kubler-Ross, is writing from the position of non-faith. She is totally writing from a position, a medical position, of as a physician looking at patients. And so we have to realize that some people, many people, depend on denial as a way of keeping themselves together. Number 50, we'll go to stage 2, which is anger. Feelings of anger, rage, resentment at God, family, doctors, nurses, and it just shoots out in all directions. Oh, I'll tell you, I was subject to that anger as a hospice chaplain because the grieving wife needed someone to be angry at, and whoever came her way got that anger. I remember one time when I had to tell the patient, I was telling my patients this was my last week, I was taking a month off and going on a bike ride, and this one lady just flew in a rage at me because I could go off on a bike ride while her husband is dying. Of course, we had 2 other chaplains in the office, so we could cover the patients. That wasn't an issue. But the fact that I could go and have a good time while her husband was dying made her extremely angry. And although illogical, understandable. That's where she was. The center of her world was dying, and there I went on a nice bike ride. Well, now 51, we come to this question we have of why. Why me? Why John? Why not the bum down the street? And I remember after my dad died when I was 14, the next week I saw a bum in the alley going through the trash, and I couldn't understand how God could allow him to be alive, but yet my father was dead. And in Mark 15:34, my God, why have you forsaken me? Those famous words. And a Catholic priest by the name of Pierre Wolf wrote this: if Jesus in all his perfection had the audacity to ask the Father why, we can express to God all our ways, since the why of the Son of Man embraced ours. None of our ways can be excluded from his, because all of our whys are healed through his. Our whys of anger and hatred are those that most need to be saved. Job dared, Jesus dared, we have to dare as well. And our weakness gives us an added right and duty to cry out all our ways when we are nailed to the cross in agony as Jesus was. That's a lot to think about. Number 52, answers often given to Christians about the question, why? And this is one of the most discouraging parts of terminal illness in a Christian setting. When you go to your church and someone comes up with some statement like this. Number 1, God needed your dad more than you did. Well, of course, then you have this guilt trip. The child has a guilt trip because if he had relied on dad more, God wouldn't have taken him. That's a logical conclusion. Number 2, God will use the death of your little girl to make you a better person. So the grieving mother concludes that she's not worth the death of her child and is overcome with guilt. Great blessings for others will come out of his death. The grieving wife resents this because no blessing is worth the loss of her husband. Your work on earth must be finished. This preposterous thought reinforces the young mother's anger against God. Her 3- and 5-year-old are going to need her. Number 5, each person only gets so many days on earth. Here we are, the numbering of our days. It leads the hurting person to shake his fist in the face of a divine ogre who would operate in this way. And I should put in here, it speaks of determinism, not of grace. That God is not a God of grace. Number 6, Michael is happier there. So if I had made him happier here, he wouldn't have had to go there so soon. Number 7, God gives each of us our share of suffering, but never more than we can bear. This provides incredible guilt when the loved one who is left behind cracks up under the load. So number 53, at the stage of anger, any answer is inadequate. Because all of the above answers are good answers, but they're not adequate at the time. So don't fall into the trap of providing an answer. You just have to admit there simply is no answer now. And I have often told people that on this side of heaven, there is no answer. And, God is in the business of redeeming us and redeeming our situations. And that means he buys back. He buys it back, makes it good. He makes the bad good. And even the most abject tragedy, God can buy it back and redeem it and make it good. But we don't always see that. And we may not see it ever in life, or maybe we'll see it years later in life. And so, the most tragic thing that ever happened to me in my life so far was the death of my father when I was 14. But now that I have this perspective, I'm 84 in a few days. So that would be 70 years ago. It took me almost 70 years to figure out that was a blessing, because out of that horrible experience, I found God. That was the reason that I found God, was that tragedy. And that certainly was the driving force in my life to go into the ministry, to try to leave the world a better place than the way I found it. So C.S. Lewis, in his famous book, A Grief Observed, says, when I lay these questions before God, I get no answer, but a rather special sort of no answer. It is not a locked door. It's more like a silent, certainly not uncompassionate gaze, as though he shook his head not in refusal, but waiving the questions. Like, peace, child, you don't understand. So you simply say, I don't know why, but you can affirm that God is love, and he will not forsake you. He will be with you every minute through every step. And there will be a day when the answer is clear, but that day may not be on this earth, but it will come. The important thing is that the person is allowed to ask the question. Eventually, the person will give their whys to God. And Joyce Lansdorf, famous artist, famous singer of the last century, beautiful voice. She used to sing, My Eye is on the Sparrow. What a beautiful thing. Joy, I remember when her mother died, it was probably around 1960. When my mother gave God her whys, he had not answered them, but had given instead a genuine measure of peaceful confidence to tide her over. It was enough for her then, and it remains enough for my sister and for all of us now. So how do we help someone in the stage of anger? Number 54, there's 4 things we can do to help a person through anger. Number 1, spending time with the person. There's no substitute for time. It doesn't have to be a long time. It can be just 15 minutes. But time when you come and sit with them and when you're present. There's no substitute for that. Number 2, by paying attention to the person. This usually means listening. And don't worry about what you say. Just listen. Number 3, understanding the person. Where is her anger coming from? What are the real issues? And number 4, respecting the person. Treat them like a human being. Just be there for the person. Section 55 is bargaining, the third stage in the common reaction to crisis. Number 1, at first, there are pleas for complete healing. If you take away this disease, I will serve you for the rest of my life, or some other thing like that. Number 2, then pleas for extension of life. If you give me another 3 months, I'll do so-and-so. And finally, pleas for special favors, a pain-free day, stabilizing of a medical condition, or perhaps the healing of a relationship that remains broken. Section 56. We have a correction at the end of the heading. It should be the terminally ill, not the terminally full. It doesn't make sense otherwise. I did a double take when I went over that. Section 56. Okay, it is the opposite of the anger stage. Since God did not seem to hear my angry cry, perhaps he'll respond if I'm nice. This can be helpful to a person to momentarily restore a sense of hope to a grim situation. It appears to be a briefer stage than stage 2, and it's a stage to which many people often return in their dying process. Number 57, how to deal with a person in the bargaining stage. If they ask your opinion, stay neutral, don't encourage or discourage bargaining. But most people who go through this stage aren't even going to share it. Bargaining is an attempt to postpone, but above all else, whatever you do, whatever you say, don't ever take away their hope. Even if I've been there when the doctor was there, and the patient is pleading with the doctor to know how much time they have left. And the doctor is very careful because he doesn't want to rob them of hope. And the human body is so weird, and God is so great that we don't really know. And things can happen, and miracles can happen. So the last thing we want to do is to take away their hope. And I was with a man who just got diagnosed with a terrible brain tumor, a glioblastoma. And the doctor came to tell him the news, and the stunning silence. And so I said, Doctor, how many people with this condition survive for 12 months? And he said, about half. And I said, how many people survive to 5 years? And he said, 0. He was very blunt, and I was surprised. And that man, the patient, needed to hear that. He wanted that. He wanted to know. And he lived 20 months, and I visited him during the whole time. Always leaving hope. Always praying for healing if the patient asked me to, but always couching the prayer in that, God, if it be your will, heal this tumor. Number 58, stage 4, depression. Depression comes from a sense of great loss. That stage is inevitable because the patient will feel it in their body. They will feel their weakness growing and symptoms growing in their body. And it will eventually bring them out of denial and out of anger. Anger can be replaced, however, by an overwhelming sense of great loss because of all that they're going to lose. And this is also true with someone who comes to you for counseling because they lost $28 million, and now they're broke. The issues are the same. And it sounds ridiculous. A healthy person who's almost dying because they lost their money. But if you ask your grandparents or your parents about, depending how old you are, about 1929, there were perfectly healthy people jumping off of buildings because they lost their money. They lost their hope. They had no hope. Number 59, depression can be the tool to move the person into acceptance. We automatically rush in to cheer up a person, but there are times when this is the wrong thing to do. Sometimes people need to be in and to return to this stage. And Kubler-Ross says, when the depression is a tool to prepare for the impending loss of all love objects in order to facilitate the state of acceptance, then encouragements and reassurances are not as meaningful. The patient should not be encouraged to look at the sunny side of things, as this would mean he should not contemplate his impending death. It would be contradicted to tell him not to be sad, since all of us are tremendously sad when we lose one beloved person. The patient is in the process of losing everything, and final acceptance much easier, and he will be grateful to those who can sit with him during this stage of depression without constantly telling him not to be sad. And that's the sad truth. Number 60, dealing with a person in a state of depression. Well, some may need to talk a great deal and we just listen. Talk therapy is the best therapy that there is. Our greatest gift is being present to them, as I said before. Some may need to have us just hold their hand in silence. Don't try to cheer them up. Maybe they need this sad time to finally break through to acceptance. But depression can also be clinical, as we've talked to in last year. Clinical depression is permanent depression. Person is always depressed, and they need professional help. And stage 5 is acceptance. And I think that is where the healing often is. That the person prayed for physical healing, but the healing that they received was a healing that broke through into acceptance. It was a healing, I like to call it that old Catholic word, a healing of the soul rather than a healing of the body. Contemplation of the coming end with quiet acceptance. It requires time to reach this stage. Generally, by then, a patient is weak. It's noted by a lack of feelings. It's not a giving up or giving in. It's not a resigned or hopeless stage. Number 62, acceptance brings peace, not happiness. Acceptance, now this is Dr. Ross talking, acceptance should not be mistaken for a happy stage. It is almost void of feelings. It is as if the pain has gone, the struggle is over, and there comes a time for the final rest before the long journey, as one patient phrased it. This is also the time during which the family usually needs more help, understanding, and support than the patient himself. While the dying patient has found some peace and acceptance, his circle of interest diminishes. He wishes to be left alone, or at least not stirred up by news and problems of the outside world. Visitors are often not desired, and if they come, the patient is no longer in a talkative mood. So you have to coordinate with family members about your visit if you're going to visit a dying person, and make sure that the family thinks that the patient is still open to it. Number 63, dealing with a person in the stage of acceptance. Most communication is nonverbal, a holding of a hand, a smile. I remember when this man who died of a glioblastoma, he was my fire chief. At the very end, he always had a big jar of cashews covered in chocolate, which he wasn't able to eat when he was healthy. And we would eat them together, and it was great. It's okay to say nothing. A lot of people worry that, well, what am I going to say to a person? You don't have to say anything. You just be with them. The guidepost for you is for the patient to provide as much independence as possible. Give them the opportunity to make any possible decisions. Number 64, enduring to the end, maintaining hope. Dr. Ross says, in listening to our terminally ill patients, we were always impressed that even the most accepting and the most realistic patients left the possibility open for some cure, for the discovery of a new drug, or the last-minute success in a research project. It is this glimpse of hope which maintains them through days and weeks or months of suffering. It is the feeling that all of this must have some meaning, will pay off eventually, if they can only endure it for a little while longer. So allow the patients to maintain that hope. And isn't that a hope that we all share? When we're sick, or I've had little miracles in my life, physical miracles that have happened that doctors could not explain. Well, I told you before about I had a hole in my nose that when they removed a melanoma on the side of my nose, and it was large enough that it was like a half-inch across. And so 3 weeks later, they scheduled a plastic surgery for me. And it was done by the original surgeon and a plastic surgeon working together to get tissue off my hip and put it on my nose so I wouldn't have a hole in my nose. And when the original surgeon uncovered the wound, it was already filled in. And it was just inexplicable. And she was highly embarrassed that she had scheduled the plastic surgery, a surgeon to come in to help when there was no need for any additional surgery. There's no explanation for that, except it was a miracle. And don't ever think that your prayers go unanswered even if you don't see the answer. You have to wait. Number 65, Christians are to be the purveyors of hope. Hope for this life. We can pray for a miracle. And there's a story about Dr. Ross shared about a lady who prayed for healing, and then just before she died, she said, I see what the healing was. I'm not afraid. That's the healing. Then we have hope for the world to come. In Luke 23:43, this day you will be with me in paradise. In Revelations 21:4, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Dr. Gilmore writes, the matter, very simply put, is that if there is no death, there can be no life. There is purposefulness about creative dying. In the economy of God's plan for us, we die from an old level to be born into an advanced development. An infant dies to be a toddler. A toddler dies to be a young child. A young child dies to be a teenager. A teenager dies to be a young adult. A young adult dies to be an older adult. And the older adult dies to move into the life beyond flesh. This is the Christian hope. So when you go to visit a person who is dying or is in these stages from loss, it could be a divorce. You go as a purveyor of hope, because that's what we are. We are purveyors of hope. And so the last thing we ever want to do is take away a person's hope. There is no justification to take away their hope in the name of honesty. Not that you have to lie to a person. Number one, most of you are not cancer doctors that I'm aware of. And if the patient is dying of cancer, you don't know any more than the garbage man how long that person is going to live. It's not up to us to mess with those statements. We're not qualified to do that. We shouldn't do that. Maintain hope. That's what we always do with everyone. And we do that in our own lives as well. If, when we're diagnosed with cancer, when we hear the words or some other horrible thing, what do? You pray and you maintain hope. It was just a week ago, Wednesday, I underwent a procedure in the hospital where in order to, before they would agree to do the procedure, I had to agree to having open heart surgery if things didn't look good, because the procedure was too involved to have me not follow through. And I was thrilled at my age they would offer me that at 84, and I agreed readily. And I had the procedure. And the results were astounding. That not only did I not need open heart surgery, but what they saw on the echocardiogram was the result of a heart that was so muscular that the shadows that they saw were not blood clots, but it was the walls of the muscle, the vertical walls of the muscle in the heart. And they brought in, other doctors were coming in to look while I was out there laying on the table with all of this telemetry going on these screens to see that, because they couldn't believe that an 84-year-old man could have a heart like that. And yet it looked so grim just the day before. There's always hope. We never know. It's not up to us to take that hope away, but to be purveyors of hope. And you never know what gets people down. I mean, for some of us, it's ridiculous. I mean, I once counseled a 24-year-old man because he had knobby knees, and he couldn't live with his knobby knees. I mean, it bothered him immensely. And he was an athlete. The rest of him was spectacular. Who cares about his knobby knees? But it was hard for him to break out of that mold. That's all he could see was his knobby knees, and he needed psychological help to get away from that. There's always hope. Whether you have knobby knees, whether you have shadows in your heart, it doesn't matter. There's always hope, and that's what we have to maintain. We are purveyors of hope. Now time is up for you to share anything you'd like to say, but you should speak into the mic. We only have one today, and I'll bring it around.
You're speaking of hope. I was wondering in this series if you're going to talk about assisting those to die and that whole philosophy. Will that come later?
We have a whole session about it. Yeah, we have a whole session about, I think, September, something like that. We have a whole session. Yeah, the summer schedule remains to be in flux now because I'm looking at my swim schedule coming up and trying to coordinate that. And boy, I tell you, when in the summer it's swim season and you have 3 or 4 meets on every weekend, so as you notice, I skipped August, I think it was. So I may skip another month, and we're just tacking on in the fall. So it's not a problem. But yeah, we're going to cover a whole session on visiting with the dying, because that's really a hard one. And frankly, the average church member doesn't have the courage to go and visit with the dying. It takes a lot of guts to do that. But when you look at what the truth is and what the dying need, then you can really relax. As you can see that what they need is me sitting there. That's what they need. So we'll be going over that. Any other comments, suggestions, questions? It's a lot of stuff to cover in a short time, but that's why you've got 8 more pages of notes to go over. And by the time you're done, you'll have about 60 pages or something like that, 65. I think we should close in prayer. Lord, we thank you that you call us all to be purveyors of hope, not only personally in our own lives, but also to all of those around us, whether they be members of the church, whether they be Christian or not. Help us, Lord, to go forth and to truly leave the world a better place. In Jesus' name, amen.